I'm Steve Brusatte. I'm a paleontologist. I dig up dinosaurs. I teach at the University of Edinburgh. I advise on films like the Jurassic World films, and I write pop science books like The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs and the new one called The Story of Birds.
How birds became the last dinosaurs.
Birds, the birds around us today, they are dinosaurs. They are real, true dinosaurs. And that's not just a turn of phrase. That's not just some technicality. Birds are dinosaurs because they are part of the dinosaur family tree. They evolved from other dinosaurs. They are just a strange type of dinosaur that got small, evolved wings, and developed the ability to fly. And in that way, really, they're a dinosaur version of a bat. A bat is just a strange mammal that got small, evolved wings, and developed the ability to fly. But of course, it is still a mammal. And in that sense, birds are still dinosaurs. They're just the only dinosaurs that have lived on to the modern day. And this idea is so enthralling to me that it's inspired me to write my newest book, which is called The Story of Birds. And that book tells the story of how birds evolved from dinosaurs, how dinosaurs evolved feathers and wings and took to the skies, and then all the amazing things that birds have done in the 150 million years since they entered the scene. In writing The Story of Birds, I learned a lot, and I gained an incredible appreciation for birds. But the birds today, even the really scariest ones today, and I'm not talking about robins, I'm talking about the properly scary ones, say hawks and eagles and vultures and so on, they pale in comparison to some of the extreme, eccentric, extinct birds that once lived. And I'm talking about things like terror birds. Okay, I think the name says it all, but the nickname is well-deserved. These were the top predators on South America for tens of millions of years after the asteroid. They became bigger than humans. They had heads bigger than a horse's head, with a big, nasty, hooked beak at the end that they used for devouring prey. They were ferocious. They could run fast. They had big, powerful legs for kickboxing their prey. There were things called demon ducks that lived on Australia for tens of millions of years. Now, this nickname is a little bit unfair. It's a little bit of a misnomer because they wouldn't have been very demonic. They were big. They were like 100 times the size of a modern duck, but they were plant eaters. And they were, in fact, some of the most important big plant eaters at the base of the food chain in Australia, along with some marsupials like kangaroos and wallabies and so on, for many tens of millions of years. Our human ancestors, and actually not even our ancestors, our species, Homo sapiens, when they first reached Australia, met the demon ducks, ate demon duck eggs for breakfast. There are archaeological sites where there are charred demon duck eggs, sadly, probably why they went extinct. But they were some of the heaviest birds of all time. Joined with another group, there's like a joint heavyweight title with these things called elephant birds from Madagascar that stood like 10 feet tall, that weighed like 700 or more pounds. Actually, some of them may have even pushed close to a ton, weighed more than cows. They laid eggs the size of watermelons. There were things that were called colossus penguins. These were penguins that were taller than a human and weighed as much as a gorilla. They were the top predators in the southern oceans after the ocean reptiles went extinct with the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous. Later on, they were superseded by killer whales and big sharks, but for many, many millions of years, it was gigantic penguins that were the big fish eaters and flesh eaters of the oceans. And there were some giant birds. A lot of these, by the way, I should say, the big penguins, the terror birds, the elephant birds, the demon ducks, they could not fly in the air. They gave up flight in order to get so big. But there was one group that got big, but maintained the ability to fly, and these were what we call the pelagornithids. They don't have a catchy nickname yet. Somebody needs to come up with one. Let me know if any of you have any good ideas. But these had 20-foot wingspans. They were like kites, giant kites that soared the thermals around the world for many tens of millions of years, giant hang gliders. And I could go on and on and on, but the point really is that the birds we see today, as diverse, as remarkable as they are, really, it's just, they pale in comparison to a lot of the birds that once lived that are now extinct. Now, this idea that birds are dinosaurs, that birds evolved from dinosaurs, you might think that it is a brazen, audacious new idea proposed by the new generation of paleontologists. But no, and it's not. In fact, it's a very old idea. And it goes back to the time of Charles Darwin. It was in the 1860s, right as Darwin was releasing The Origin of Species, articulating his ideas for evolution by natural selection. It was then that some of Darwin's closest scientist friends made the connection between dinosaurs and birds. And it was Darwin's dear friend, Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. That's what they called him because he was so voracious in the way that he advocated for Darwin's ideas. Huxley was a great communicator of science. This was a day, in a time before there were a lot of pop science books, but people communicated science quite broadly through lectures, and this is what Huxley did. And very famously, in the 1860s, in a series of lectures, beginning in London, Huxley proposed this idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs. And this was in service of more broadly communicating to the public that Darwin's ideas about evolution were true. What Huxley understood is that, yes, today's birds are very distinctive, with their feathers, their wings, their wishbones, their beaks, their lightweight skeletons, their stubby tails, their fast growth, their high-powered metabolism, of course, their ability to fly. These are very unique things, and there's really nothing else today that looks like a bird. But if you look into the fossil record, you can actually see that there are more primitive creatures that lived long ago that have many bird-like features, and these are dinosaurs. This was around the time in the 1860s that some of the very first good skeletons of dinosaurs were being found, and Huxley noted the similarities. And they were things as basic as, look at the foot of a chicken, and it really looks like the foot of a small meat-eating dinosaur with the 3 toes and the claws and so on. This was before anybody even knew what DNA was, so it was all based on similarities in the fossils. And what really clinched the deal for Huxley was when this new fossil was discovered in the early 1860s in southern Germany from rocks that dated back to the Jurassic period, about 150 million years ago. This was the fossil of a bird. It had wings, it had feathers. Of course it was a bird. What else could it be but? It was no normal bird. It was a weird bird. It still had teeth in its jaws, little steak knife teeth that looked like the teeth of a little dinosaur. It had big claws on its hands, like the claws of a little dinosaur. It had a long, bony tail. It really looked like it was half bird, half dinosaur. Now, this is Archaeopteryx. It remains a famous fossil. It remains the oldest known true bird, an animal with feathers and wings that could fly. And in it, Huxley saw this perfect intermediate stage, this Frankenstein creature. And this was the argument that he made to the masses. And by the end of the 1860s, actually, people, at least in Britain, were convinced largely that birds came from dinosaurs. Darwin put it into his latest editions of The Origin of Species. It became a widely known idea. But then, as often happens in science, when an idea starts to reach consensus, it started to attract its contrarians. And people started to find new dinosaurs, giant dinosaurs, as the American West opened up. Allosaurus and Brontosaurus and Stegosaurus. These things look nothing like birds. So how in the world could a bird come from dinosaurs like these? That's what people started to argue. And it took many decades for the debate to circle back around through the discovery of some really bird-like raptor dinosaurs like Velociraptor and Deinonychus that brought it back and that showed that Huxley was actually right. And then in the 90s, finally people discovered feathers on dinosaur fossils, and that was it, the final piece of evidence to prove once and for all that yes, today's birds really did evolve from dinosaurs. In the world today, you look around, there are so many birds that we are familiar with. There are more than 10,000 species of birds, and we see them around us. Many of us go bird watching. Some of us have pet birds. Some of us enjoy chicken for dinner. There are so many birds. All of that diversity stems from dinosaurs. And it's not like there were 10,000 different dinosaurs that gave rise to the different species of birds today. No, what happened was that there was basically one great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother dinosaur that evolved the ability to fly, and from that ancestor sprang all of the diversity of modern birds today. But that ancestor and the descendants of that ancestor had to traverse and endure so many tribulations. They had to do the same thing our mammal ancestors did, and that is survive the asteroid that ended the Cretaceous and killed 75% of all species, including every other type of dinosaur. And it really is a remarkable story, because imagine, if you will, an alternative world where every type of mammal, including us, goes extinct and only bats survive. That's basically what happened to the dinosaurs. So how do they do it? We can say, well, birds, okay, they could fly, so that could help them get away from danger very quickly. Birds are generally small. They could hide away more easily than a T-Rex or a Triceratops. Those things probably help them, and that is certainly true. But the real crux of the issue, the real mystery is, why did only one type of bird survive? Because when the asteroid hit, there was a whole panoply of birds. There were very derived, advanced modern birds with beaks that grew really fast and could fly really well, but there were still birds with teeth and long tails and claws on their hands. So why did only modern birds survive? Why did they not follow T-Rex and Triceratops to the grave? And it seems like it is probably because simply the Earth devolved into this fickle casino. There was no time for species to adapt through the longer-term processes of natural selection. You had to face the asteroid and the tsunamis and the fires and the earthquakes and the nuclear winter. You had to face that with whatever hand of cards you were already dealt. And modern-style birds not only could fly, not only were they small, but they grew super fast and reproduced really quickly. That would help. The generations could turn over quickly. And they had beaks. These were some of the birds that had beaks, and those beaks were very good at eating seeds. And that might sound trivial, but today, when there's a forest fire, when a volcano obliterates an island, plants will grow back. And why is that? Because seeds can last a long time. If you were an animal at the end of the Cretaceous and you ate parts of a growing plant, leaves, flowers, fruits, roots, your food would have run out really quickly. But if you could eat seeds, that would be your ticket for surviving longer. That would be like the last food source available. So having beaks, eating seeds, in addition to being small and flying well and growing fast, was probably the winning hand of cards at this crazy, maniacal poker table at the end of the Cretaceous. And I think it is a really, in many ways, quite haunting image, but also an image of resiliency to think about in those weeks and months and maybe years after the asteroid. So many animals died, but there were these modern-style birds like Asteriornis, which is known from Europe, Vagavus from Antarctica, these birds that would have been using their beaks to pick through the wreckage, spearing seeds amidst all the fungal spores and the glass bullets from the asteroid and the charcoal from the wildfires. And something that seems so trivial, so basic, just so happened to be their get-out-of-jail-free card. And that, in large part, is what allowed birds to survive to the modern day. When we look at birds today, they are utterly unique and distinctive. There are no other animals that really look anything like birds, especially when it comes to feathers and those sort of aspects that are distinctly avian. But more broadly, there are so many parts of the bird body that work together to enable that most birdie of things, and that is to fly in an active way by flapping the wings, powered flight. And you think of wings and feathers, but you also think of a light skeleton, bones filled with air, a wishbone that acts as a spring as the wings beat, a short tail with a big fan of feathers that's used as a rudder and for steering and for landing. There are so many things that if you take any one of those features away from a bird, it couldn't fly or it couldn't fly very well. So you might think that these things all evolved for flying so that birds could fly. But no, what we see in the fossil record is that these classic features of birds are actually dinosaur features. Almost all of them first evolved in the dinosaur ancestors of birds. They evolved long before birds or these dinosaur ancestors could fly. They must have evolved for reasons other than flying. And the story of a bird evolving is really a story of gradual piecemeal evolution. Tens of millions of years of different features evolving one by one in different dinosaur ancestors for different reasons, but then coming together eventually, really through chance, to form what could function as a flying machine. And I think the best analogy for that is that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. We all know that story. But they didn't invent all the components of the airplane. They didn't invent the wheel. They didn't invent the propeller. They didn't invent the wing. Other people had invented those things, many thousands of years before in some cases, for different reasons. But the Wright brothers put them together in a way that could fly. We can talk about a few of the different classic features of birds and actually see how they first evolved in dinosaurs. One of them is walking bipedally. That's just the fancy way of saying just walking on the hind legs. This is what we do, so we kind of take it for granted, but really it's quite unusual in nature. And there's this famous line from the ancient Greeks that humans, how do you define humans? Well, they are featherless bipeds. So really what that means is just that the other animals alive today that walk on their hind legs are birds. Now you might think, okay, birds need to walk on their hind legs. They have their wings, they use their wings to fly, they use their legs to land and to take off and to move on the ground. But no, actually being bipedal long predates flying. Early dinosaurs became bipedal. Some of the first dinosaurs living on Pangaea back in the Triassic period started walking only on their hind legs. Probably in order to move faster, to run faster, to move more efficiently, to free their hands for doing different things, for grabbing food, and so on. So it had nothing to do with flying. Feathers. Feathers. Nothing is more birdy than feathers. You find a feather, you see one fluttering around in the breeze, you know a bird was there. No lizard, no snake, no turtle, no mammal, no fish has feathers. They are uniquely bird features. But when we look at the fossil record, we see that a lot of dinosaurs had feathers. We actually see that feathers were normal for dinosaurs. We have dozens of different types of dinosaurs that have been found with feathers all over their bodies. Small dinosaurs the size of dogs, big dinosaurs. There's a tyrannosaur that's more than 30 feet long and weighed more than a ton. It had feathers all over its body. We see plant-eating dinosaurs with feathers and meat-eating dinosaurs with feathers. If you map this onto the family tree of dinosaurs, really the only conclusion is that feathers must go deep into dinosaur history. Probably the common ancestor of all dinosaurs, maybe even a more distant ancestor, first evolved feathers. But what we see from the fossils is that most of these feathers were quite simple. They were the starting stages, the beginnings of bird feathers. Most of these feathers were just little strands that looked like hair. They were hollow inside. They were made of these beta proteins that feathers today are made of, so we know they are feathers, but they're a simpler form of feathers. That's what most dinosaurs had. And those kind of feathers were normal for dinosaurs in the same way that hair is normal for mammals. And I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. We cannot fly with our hair. Okay, some of us have more hair than others, but if you have the most luxurious mane of hair, you can't fly with it. So these dinosaurs that had these hairy feathers, they could not fly with them. That means feathers must have evolved for something else initially. And we think it was for the same reason hair evolved in mammals, to help control body temperature, to stay warm, part of the metabolism, part of becoming more active and energetic and warm-blooded. Most dinosaurs had those simple feathers, but some dinosaurs elaborated those feathers, and these were the raptor dinosaurs. And as their bodies were getting smaller over time, they packed those feathers ever more densely all over themselves. And they started to line up some of those feathers on their arms, sometimes on their legs and on their tails. And those feathers changed from simple little hairs into brushes so they branched out. And some of them became rigid but pliable and became the classic quill pen feather that we know today, the classic feather of birds. And some of these dinosaurs even had wings on their arms and sometimes their legs and their tails made of these feathers, and they look just like the wings of birds today. But, again, the fossils throw a curveball because wings show up on dinosaurs that are about the size of sheep up to the size of horses. That's where wings first evolve. And those wings are no bigger than a laptop screen. So just by the laws of physics, there's no way that if that dinosaur flapped those wings that it could get aloft, that it could get the lift and the thrust, those aerodynamic forces needed to stay in the air and move around the air. So that means that even wings must have evolved for another reason. And we don't know exactly, we weren't there to witness evolution, but we can tell from the fossil melanin, the fossil color pigments in some of these dinosaur feathers, that they had quite elaborate colors and patterns. So we think that some of these dinosaurs were using those wings for display, basically advertising billboards sticking off the arms to attract mates, to intimidate rivals. What a peacock does today, it's not flying with that tail. And that's probably why wings first evolved. And then wings later on were repurposed as airfoils for flying. And it probably happened quite by accident. But the key thing is that feathers and wings did not first evolve for flying. The fossils make that clear. They were repurposed. But how were they repurposed? And did this happen once or did this happen multiple times? The reality is we don't have a firm answer, and it's not because we don't have the fossils. It's because, in a way, we have too many fossils. We have so much evidence, it's hard to make a clear through line with this evidence. But by and large, what the evidence that we know now, what that tells me, is that flying probably evolved multiple times in dinosaurs. And that modern birds are just one of those experiments in flying, the one that's happened to reach the modern day. Now, what's the evidence for that? Well, the evidence for that is there's a whole bunch of dinosaurs with feathers, with wings, but they're very different types of wings. Some have wings only on their arms. Some have wings on their arms and their legs. Some have wings on their tails. Usually the wings are made of feathers, but there's this one type of dinosaur. It's called Yiqi. It's from China. It had a wing made of skin, kind of like a bat. Now, it also had feathers on the rest of its body. These are such different configurations. I mean, it's like the difference between a jet airplane and a passenger jet, a fighter jet, a blimp, a hang glider, a space shuttle, a rocket ship. The vast differences seem to indicate that there were different experiments in flying. And probably what happened was you reached this point in dinosaur history where there was this zone on the family tree of dinosaurs where there were a bunch of small dinosaurs that had feathers, that had wings. They evolved these from ancestors for different reasons. But now they could experiment with different ways. And they were all kind of around that threshold where their wings were big enough compared to their bodies that just through the laws of physics, they could flutter about in the air a little bit. Modern birds would have come out of that, or the lineage leading to modern birds, which then really changes the question in a way to how did modern birds, how did that one particular type of flying dinosaur start to fly? And here I won't profess to have an answer. I don't think we know the answer. There are different theories. And some of those theories sound pretty good. But the issue is that we weren't around to see it. And I think the fossils that we have are compatible with different scenarios. Now, some of the different theories are, there's one that's called the ground-up theory. And this is the idea that you had these small dinosaurs that had evolved wings for different reasons, for display. And they started to move those wings, and those wings gave them some lift and some thrust as they were running, and they allowed them to defy gravity. Okay, that could have definitely happened. Now, there's an alternative theory that it happened the other way, from the trees down, that there were small dinosaurs with wings living up in the canopy, using those wings for displaying to mates and rivals, and then also sometimes for gliding, for parachuting. And then by moving those wings, by flapping them, they would get more control, and those wings, in a way, could be used to manipulate gravity. Those are two end members, but there's other theories in between that maybe it's little baby dinosaurs as they're learning to move that flap their wings, and that got them a bit of lift and thrust. There's all sorts of ideas. And evolution by natural selection, it doesn't work with a plan in mind. There's no grand designer that 230 million years ago, when the first dinosaur entered the scene on Pangaea, that pushed some button and said, one day these dinosaurs will fly. No. Evolution through natural selection doesn't work with that kind of agency. It really just works to fit individuals and their populations to their own time and place. And if there's some small change that can help an individual live a bit longer, survive a bit better, reproduce a bit more, have more offspring, that sort of feature, that is an adaptation that can then cascade through the population and change over time, and that's how species change over time. So everything about birds evolving from dinosaurs evolved through that process, steady accumulation of features over time. Then after some of these dinosaurs started to fly, it's not just that evolution stopped. No. Evolution turned their bodies into more efficient flying machines. And two of the ways that happens with the tail and with the beak. So the tails of the dinosaur ancestors of birds are really long, straight, bony tails. They had feathers on them, but they were quite cumbersome. Birds today basically don't have a tail at all. They just have a little nubbin of bone. It's called the pygostyle. If you roast a chicken on your Thanksgiving turkey, you might see this little thing that's often called the parson's nose in really old cookbooks, because it's this really fatty, glandular mess of tissue surrounding this tiny little fused up remnant of a tail. So birds have that kind of tail because nowadays birds anchor a whole bunch of feathers, of big feathers, to that tail, that shortened tail, and they use those feathers to steer and to brake and as a rudder. They're very important in takeoff and landing. So they change that long dinosaur tail into a tail that's more controllable and can be used for aerodynamics. When it comes to the front of the body, to the snout, to the face, to the business end, birds today have beaks. It's one of those classic bird things. The first birds did not have beaks. The first birds had a bunch of small little razor-sharp steak knife teeth on their jaws that looked just like the teeth of a velociraptor. Archaeopteryx, the very oldest true bird fossil from the Jurassic, has those raptor dinosaur teeth. We see over time the teeth reduce and the teeth are replaced by a beak. And this seems to have happened not just once, but many times independently. And it might have had something to do with flying, at least in part. Losing teeth, having a beak may have saved a little bit of weight for flying. Being very lightweight is important. But really, it probably had more to do with diet, with what these animals were eating. Maybe with foods that they were now able to eat better because they were flying. Things like different types of insects, different types of seeds, things that they could access more easily in the forest now that they could fly. But by the end of this all, by the end of the Cretaceous period, the time of T-Rex, the time of Triceratops, there were a whole bunch of birds flying overhead of those dinosaurs. Some were still quite primitive. Some still had teeth and claws and long tails. Others looked a whole lot like birds today, with a beak, with a short stubby tail, with the fan of tail feathers. And that's where the world stood on that day that the asteroid came down. When we go out from the city, away from cars, away from sirens, away from the many sounds of modern life, and we just listen, so much of what we hear, the soundscape of nature, is birds. It's birds singing and tweeting and squawking. And you think about birds today like songbirds that sing songs that they learn from tutors, that it's like a teacher and a student, and they have this babbling phase where they learn like a toddler. I was writing this book, as my little boy was growing up, and the parallels there just blew my mind. Now, when did that evolve? That's a really interesting question, because it gets at, would the Cretaceous world of T-Rex, let's say, what would that soundscape have been like? Would it have been like the modern world, or would it have been very different? Might it have just have been the trees rustling and the T-Rexes screaming and the bugs buzzing around? The movies certainly aren't right. They wouldn't be roaring like lions. That's a very big cat thing, enabled by the unique vocal cords and bones of the throat of big cats. So to me, these are the questions, especially when, I'm working on films and consulting on programs that we often think about. What would that world have been like? Sound doesn't fossilize. There's no Cretaceous cassette tape that we can find in the fossil record and plug in and hear what these things were sounding like. But sometimes we do get clues from the fossils themselves. And in some rare cases, the vocal organs do preserve. And there is a bird fossil from about 68, 69 million years ago from Antarctica. This bird is called Vegavis. It's a very modern style bird. It had a beak. It grew really fast. It had big wings. It was actually in the duck and chicken part of the bird family tree. So a very modern bird living roughly at the same time as T-Rex. The bones are well preserved. And inside the chest cavity, right above where the lung would have been, where the chest connects to the throat, is this cartilage structure that looks just like the voice box of modern birds, the syrinx. So it must be a syrinx. Now, a syrinx is a uniquely bird thing. We don't have it. We vocalize in the larynx in our throat. We have the vocal cords. That's the way mammals do it, and actually lots of other animals vocalize in the throat too. But birds have this organ basically right on top of their lungs, and it is an incredible organ. It has some of the fastest twitching muscle in the animal kingdom. Both sides of it in some species can work separately. So it'd be like you can speak English and French at the same time. I mean, it just blows my mind that birds can do this. We know that organ was present in at least some birds living in the Cretaceous period. So by the end of the Cretaceous, you would have had some birds that could sound like the birds of today. But it is really just one clue. We need to learn so much more. There are birds today that can migrate incredible distances. There are the finches on the Galapagos that are still evolving. They are spinning out new species in front of our eyes. And then there are birds like crows and ravens and parrots, which have huge brains, some of the biggest brains relative to body size of any animals, more so even than many mammals. They are basically feathered apes. And we know it. When a parrot repeats words that we say more clearly sometimes than we can. Amazing. When a crow recognizes itself in a mirror. When a crow fashions its own tools. I mean, a lot of animals use tools. They might pick up a stick and use it to prod open a nest of bugs or something, or to scratch. A lot of animals use tools. Crows do something that really humans and maybe some other primates can do, and that is fashion their own tools. They take sticks and other things and actually make hooks out of them and use them to get food. These are incredible feats of intelligence. And these are seen in animals that are with us, that share the world with us today. And I don't think we appreciate it enough. I don't think I appreciated it enough before writing the book, but I've really come to love a lot of these birds. And it's also inspired a lot of my research as a scientist. My lab at the University of Edinburgh, a lot of my students and I, we're working now with a big team of zoologists and neurobiologists to study how cognition and intelligence have evolved over time, and to try to make links between the intelligence and behaviors of modern species, especially birds, with things like T-Rexes and Brontosauruses. How did a dinosaur sense its world? We're trying to get at questions like that. And it's all inspired by learning more about birds. When it comes down to it, for me, it is astounding to look at even the most common bird, even a bird that might annoy us, even a bird that we don't give much credit to. We might swear under our breath at the pigeon that's walking in front of us on the street. Those birds, though, they are dinosaurs. They are real, bona fide, unequivocal, absolute, 100% living dinosaurs. They evolved from dinosaurs. They are part of the dinosaur family tree. They have all the classic features of dinosaurs. They are the only dinosaur that has survived all the whims and catastrophes of Earth history and extinctions and volcanoes and asteroids to reach the world today. And more than anything, that's what I appreciate about birds. They are the only ones of my beloved dinosaurs, the animals that inspired me to become a scientist as a teenager. They're the only ones of the dinosaur family that have made it to the world today, and they give us an opportunity to watch, to experience, to appreciate actual, real dinosaurs.
Want to support the channel? Join the Big Think members community where you get access to videos early, ad-free.